Well, we finished chapter 1 and now we move on to Hebrews chapter 2. Let me set the tone for Hebrews chapter 2 by reading the first 4 verses. Then we'll unpack these verse by verse. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. For this reason, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away from it. For if the word spoken through angels proved unalterable, and every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? After it was first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard. God also testifying with them both by signs and wonders and by various miracles and by gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. In order to drive home the importance of the superiority of the Son of God over angels, in these verses, the writer pushes for the readers to respond. We is how he says it. We includes all those who are Hebrews. Some had agreed intellectually to the doctrine of God's Messiah being superior to the angels, but had not committed themselves to him as God and Lord. The argument the writer is making in verses 2 and 3 is an argument from the lesser to the greater. In verse 2, the message God delivered through the angels has always stood firm. Then what comes from the one superior to the angels must be greater. So let's look at chapter 2, verse by verse. Verse 1, we must pay close attention to what we heard and not drift away. The warning is to secure ourselves to the truth of the gospel, being careful not to pass by the only place of salvation. Close attention must be paid to these serious matters of the Christian faith. Every transgression, verse 2, every transgression and disobedience receives a just penalty. Transgression and disobedience. Transgression means to step across the line, an obvious sin of commission. That means you know it's sin, but you do it anyway. Disobedience carries the idea of shutting one's ears to God's commands, thereby committing the sin of omission. Both are willful, both are serious, and both demand just judgment. Now, we can claim we didn't know, but if you've read the scriptures or you've heard the message preached, you should know. That's why God says, study to show thyself approved. A workman need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. If disobedience to the older covenant of law brought a swift judgment, how much more severe will the judgment be of disobedience of the new covenant gospel of salvation, which was mediated by Jesus Christ, who is superior to the angels? The messenger and the message of the new covenant are greater than the messenger and the message of the older covenant. The greater the privilege, the greater the punishment for disobedience or neglect by, verse 3, those who heard him. This phrase reveals the progression of evangelism. That generation of Hebrews would not have heard it if the previous generation of witnesses had not passed this message along. So look at, in your time, Luke 12:47, for the greater punishment. The servant who knows the master's will and does not do what the master wants will be beaten with many blows. Let's go move on to verse 4. God also testifying with them. The supernatural power demonstrated by Jesus and by his apostles, were the Father's divine confirmation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, his Son. This validation of the message was the purpose of these miraculous deeds. How? How is that possible? Well, it was possible by the gifts of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, by giving gifts, is confirming the message of salvation by means of these miraculous gifts. I'll read verses 6 through 8 for you. What is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crowned him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hand. You have put all things under his feet. Now, these verses are quoted from Psalms chapter 8, verses 4 through 6, which is also quoted in the New Testament, as you see. These verses were asking, why would God ever bother with man? Well, verse 9 says, well, let me back up. Verse 9 and 10 demonstrates the incarnation of Christ is the greatest proof of God's love and concern for mankind. Verse 9 reads this way: he was crowned with glory and honor so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. Because Jesus became obedient to the point of death, God also highly exalted him. By his redemptive work, Christ has fulfilled all that is required as the supreme representation of mankind. By his incarnation, his substitutionary sacrifice, and victory over sin and death, Christ has fulfilled man's original purpose as the second Adam. He was, for a short time, lower than the angels. The verses read said he tasted death for everyone who believed, that is. The death of Christ can only be applied in its usefulness to those who come to God repentantly in faith, asking for saving grace and forgiveness of sin. Now Jesus has glory and honor in all things, including angels that are subject to him.